Over the last 6 months, 18 months, it seems every single real estate forum I'm in, the topic comes up of affordable housing. In fact, there are many people that are saying now that this is the single most imperative issue we are facing right now in the real estate industry, and maybe as a society as a whole in the Western world.
You are listening to the AFIRE podcast, real estate, technology, cross-border investing, and the opportunities of a changing world. Let's start a conversation now.
And it's no wonder, you have Realtor.com reporting that we have a shortage of 7.2 million homes. We just haven't been building as fast as the population has been growing. We have easily over 500,000 people that are experiencing homelessness right now in the United States. And it's growing. It's becoming more and more expensive as the markets are tightening, as there's a shortage of appropriate housing. All housing is becoming more and more expensive and perhaps more and more out of reach for more people. It's a big issue. How do we solve it? Well, we don't all have answers for that, although there's a lot of yelling. There's a lot of talk. There's a lot of, you ought to do this and you ought to do that. The question I have is less, what do we tell other people to do, and what is it that we can do as investors, as developers, as builders, as owners and operators to create more and more successful tenancy to make sure that people are able to live their lives well? Now, there's someone that I go to when I'm trying to figure out what's going on in affordable housing, and I'm lucky enough to have him here on the podcast today. We're sitting here in the middle of April of 2024. And I'm speaking with Paul Bernard. He's the CEO of Affordable Homes and Communities, located in the DC area in Arlington, Virginia. And not coincidentally, the highest levels of homelessness currently on a per capita basis are occurring in Washington, DC. The need is dire. So here's someone who's trying to solve it and working within a real estate owner, operator, developer that's explicitly focused on affordable housing. And so I'm hoping that he'll be able to open up some ideas and some directions for all of us to think about as investors going forward. So thank you so much, Paul, for joining me on the AFIRE podcast.
Thank you, Gunnar.
So I think there's two questions, right? Two big questions we'll try to address here in the conversation. One is, we might as well address what should be done? What is the stuff that has to happen in order to make it better? And then number two, given the situation we're in, what can we do? What can we do right away? Even if, oh, darn it, the government's standing in the way. Oh, darn it, the NIMBYs are standing in the way. Or darn it, the land prices are too high. Construction costs are too high. Those are all there. But what can we do about it? So I just want to give a little picture of, what is it systemically that's happening that's keeping us from having more housing and more affordable housing?
I love that, Gunnar. You broke that into two pieces, having more housing and having affordable housing, because I think we first need to start with definitions.
Right.
Affordable housing in and of itself is not a commodity. I do think we should start talking first about housing affordability. Right. And from that perspective, I adopt the definitions of enterprise, I adopt the definitions of HUD, that if you're paying more than 30% of your gross income for housing expense, then that's not affordable. And that can occur at a number of different levels, whether it's 80%, 120% of average median income, down to 30% of average median income. If you're paying more than 30% of your income for housing, that's not going to be affordable, nor is it sustainable. So this notion of housing affordability versus affordable housing.
What that seems to suggest then, Paul, is that there are folks at every income level that are having affordability issues potentially, if they're paying more than a third of their income for housing. And that seems to be a lot of people, especially in some of the major metros.
That's absolutely correct. And then what happens is, because we're having this supply crunch, those folks who are pressed at the higher levels end up crowding out those individuals at the lower levels, that then even exacerbates the problem at the 30, 40, 60% AMI level, because they're squeezed out. And as you can see, the whole notion of lack of supply versus demand just starts inflating the prices. So you're just caught, in this cycle of prices going up, the landscape becoming less and less affordable. And so we have to solve a number of problems at the same time. We have to solve the supply problem. And then I was going to say there's the secondary problem where folks look at affordable housing and affordable housing, it being a stigma, that
Right.
somehow affordable housing is an inferior good.
Right.
And unfortunately, when you send that message out there, there's so many other issues that open up from that perspective.
So this whole idea that affordable housing is for poor people, therefore it's going to be kind of crummy housing. It's going to be substandard, or it's going to be
That's right.
barely at
That's right.
standard. And also it tends to be in those areas, those neighborhoods that people don't want to live, that are inconvenient, that are perhaps not as nice as some of the nicer areas, not as much greenery, not as much pleasant kind of experience, and not as close to the very things that everyone needs in terms of easy transit, availability of work, close to schools, all those kinds of things. I do find it interesting that affordable housing, at least in our lifetimes, has very much been almost like a prison. Even the stuff where we're trying so hard to make it available to more and more people. Are you saying that it's possible for us to go beyond that?
Well, what's interesting, if you look at history, Gunnar, the notion of where affordable housing has been, let's say in the 40s and 50s, versus how we understand affordable housing today. And that gets to my third point. It's understanding where housing fits in our environment. Housing, it should be viewed from my perspective as very important economic development infrastructure.
Right.
And that's how it was viewed. Public housing was a step up for folks back in the 50s,
Right.
where it was a temporary occurrence to allow people to do whatever it is they needed to build their capacity to move forward in life. And unfortunately, we've reached this point where it's viewed as warehousing now. It's not integrated back into what we're trying to do to grow our gross national product. So to me, we need to view housing as very critical infrastructure to things like social, economic, community development. It's not shelter, and it's not a place just to warehouse the poor. That's not what it is.
Right. And, it seems to me that there's this incredible conflict that occurs where people don't want to have affordable housing near where they live. And yet, even if you're well off, you very much need to have a robust economy with people at every level of the economic scale to do the work that we all do. I mean, you want your teachers to be able to live in the district that your kids are going to school. You want the people that are repairing your house to be able to live somewhere nearby and not somewhere out in the hinterlands. And yet we're continuing to separate people out, to push them out even further and further. Why do you think that happens? Why do you think people are not seeing how it's in their best interest to have affordable housing next door?
There's a bit and piece of me that believes, unfortunately, human nature tries to figure out a way to take the path of least resistance.
Mm-hmm.
If you look at sort of the development activity across the country, not a problem at the higher level, at the higher end, being able to provide for supply. That's not the issue. But what we're finding to be the issue across the nation, sort of the missing middle, ends up being an issue, an argument. At the luxury end, enough supply. Missing middle, and at the lower ends, that's where you're not finding enough supply, and in part because it doesn't provide the same margins as at those higher ends. And so to me, that's where perhaps, and we'll talk about this a little bit later, you have to have more directed policy and perhaps even more directed government intervention to boost production in those places where the market just is not going to satisfy. So I do not look at the private market alone to be able to solve the problem of housing affordability or affordable housing.
When you talk to people, a lot of people on the street, they don't understand that there's actually a housing shortage going on. Especially if there's someone planning a new development in their neighborhood, there's this resistance going, there's too much new development taking place, and there's too much development, therefore we need to stop the development. It's almost as if people don't understand what it means to be 7.2 million homes short. And that's not just in big cities. That's not just in DC. That's not just in New York. That's across the country, in cities big and small. We do not have enough housing, and we certainly don't have housing where it should be. We need development. somehow we've got to get all of us together as a people, and government has a big part of this, to understand that we need housing, that developers are not necessarily the mustache twirling evil characters that are destroying your land.
Agreed.
That they can be your partner. Obviously, there are wicked people in every profession, but for the most part, what we really need, what we all need, is more housing, and at every level.
Well, we've had this conversation in the past, and matter of fact, I believe you've featured some of these folks in some of your programming, and Ed Glazier, who talks about the importance of density. We know that, or at least we believe, the theory would suggest there's a direct correlation between population growth and economic development.
Right.
And so, in order to fuel sustainable economic development, you will need growing populations, which to me equates into density. And you can either be enlightened and learn it the easy way, or begin to die on the vine. And there are a number of communities around the Washington, D.C. area that started off with more of a suburban-like model, even though they were in an urban context, and they're suffering now because the densities just aren't there. Yeah, I take my hat off to folks like Mayor Bowser of Washington, D.C., who to me is an enlightened leader who understood the importance of housing enough where she's dedicated 2 terms, $100 million annually into a housing trust fund. And to me, that's understanding where housing and housing supply fits into economic stability, community and social stability, for a place like the district. And as a result, a couple of things have happened. One, she's far exceeded her goals in terms of housing production. Unfortunately, on the lower end, there's still issues in terms of housing supply for folks in that 60% average median income space or 30% average median income space. But total supply of housing, she solved that.
Part of what's interesting to me is that we, at least in the real estate industry, we know this instinctively. The growth of the Sun Belt over the last 20 to 30 years, to a certain extent, has been driven by higher affordability of housing. So you can attract a labor force across the board at every level in order to build and grow a successful company. And interestingly, as the Sun Belt has succeeded, housing has become more and more of a problem in a lot of these cities, including places like Phoenix and the various cities in Texas have become more expensive. They've lost a lot of that arbitrage, if you will, between the North and the South. We're all suffering. But that was one of those growth engines, just that there was housing, that it was affordable, that people could have a nice home without having, a huge income. And that makes a difference in terms of being able to attract talent, build companies, do all the things that we believe in a capitalist society that we want to have. I love what you said, housing as infrastructure.
That's right.
This is how you build a metropolitan area in a successful city. But I also want to go back a little bit to this suburban versus urban kind of struggle. So there always seems to be, every time you're in a more suburban environment, like Northern Virginia or Maryland, in these places that you are operating in, as soon as we talk about increasing density, the reaction quite often is, you guys are trying to turn us into New York City.
Right.
Whenever you start talking about urban development in these suburban areas, and yet, for the most part, with the exception of New York City, there's quite a lot of space between where a suburb or a traditional bedroom community suburb and a more urbanized community is. There's so much room between there and New York City. There's a couple hundred years of room between the two. And the most successful suburbs, those suburbs that are increasing in value, that have more and more vitality, are actually urbanized. They're creating high density levels, whether people realize it or not. And that's true certainly in the DMV. That's true in areas as varied as the suburbs of Chicago or some of the suburban regions in California and in Texas. They're becoming more urbanized, where you have multifamily, where you have a range of incomes, a mixed income environment, mixed use environment, and you have the great coffee shop, and you have the great shopping, and you have the great community engagement and programming, all the things that people are looking for. but it still feels like a suburb because it's not as dense as New York City, perhaps. But when you are working in Northern Virginia and Maryland and these areas, how do you approach or how do you think people need to evolve to understand what urban means?
That's a very good question, Gunnar. And I want to be the first to say, this still is a journey for me.
Yeah.
I've been in this business for a very long time, and it evolves and it changes. And, I've been asking myself a lot of questions in terms of what makes sense in certain areas. Perhaps one size doesn't fit all. I'm reminded of the movement. I want to say again, 40s, 50s, the movement of new urbanism,
Right.
which, to me was a nod back to, well, we're becoming too suburban and disconnected. Maybe we need to think about our planning in a way that brings folks together. And so I believe, if you were to ask me kind of what our approaches are, we have the benefit of being in urban places like Washington, D.C., in Baltimore, Maryland, that really clearly fit that urban fabric, and operating in places like Northern Virginia, that's probably more suburban than urban. The most important thing is to engage in conversation. And once you start engaging in conversation around what we're attempting to do and put a face on those individuals who would occupy, those places. And a lot of times it is your teachers, it is your firefighters, it is your policemen, and folks kind of discount that
Mhm.
because of the stigma associated with affordable housing. Once you do that, and then once you start having the conversation around, well, okay, if you're depending upon these individuals to actually show up to work at 9 o'clock or 8 o'clock in the morning, and they have to make this hour and a half commute, that's just not sustainable. Once you start having those conversations, it doesn't solve the problem, but it begins to sort of open up people's ideas as to what affordable housing means to their own personal welfare and for the welfare of a community. So it's a long slog, but
Yeah.
part of it to me, the benefit is, let's have the conversations and bring people in and start to sort of knock down myths. One of
Mhm.
the last things I'll say in terms of myths, and I've read a book maybe about a year ago and had a chance to speak with the author, Greg Colburn, on homelessness as a housing problem, where he goes through all the barriers and myths that we think about what causes homelessness, whether it's mental illness or people's laziness or being in Democratic versus Republican areas or jurisdictions. He breaks all that down statistically, and it really boils down to two things from his perspective, and that is high pricing of housing and elasticity of supply, that you're putting unnecessary barriers up in the housing structure of the market. And those are the two things that explain statistically homelessness. And once you get that, maybe we can move away from some of the myths. And I think that there's a need, again, those conversations, putting a face, bringing people together, trying to come up with more, I don't know, holistic solutions to this.
Well, it does also suggest that some of the problems that we're facing in terms of creating housing affordable and affordability are anti-capitalistic actions that are taking place. So by constraining the market's ability to create supply in these areas, by saying, no, you can't build here, you've got to build there, by saying that anyone who's maybe 30% of the median income, well, you're going to have to commute an hour and a half because the land is cheaper an hour and a half away. But the problem with that is you're now going to have to take transit, or you're going to have a car. You're going to have to do all these things, which are expensive in time, expensive in money, instead of being close by. And let's put it this way, for thousands of years, human beings have understood that density is your friend when you're trying to have a robust labor market.
Right.
We knew this even before we discovered capitalism, that, if people are close by, you can get a lot done. But for some reason, over the last 70 years, we've decided that density is our enemy. There are problems with density that have to be overcome. But I would argue that we have the technology. We can do it. And we do quite often make density quite pleasant. And where do people want to go when they go on vacation? People who have means, where do they go? They go to very dense areas. I
That's
mean,
right.
New York
That's
City
right.
continues to be an attractor.
That's right.
European cities are incredibly dense, even though they're not necessarily as vertical as a New York City. But where do people want to go when they're on vacation? They want to go to places where there's lots of people in a dense environment. So I think there are ways to solve for this and to make it pleasant for everybody.
I agree. And Gunnar, one of the things I forgot to throw out there was this notion of short-term thinking versus long-term, thinking for the long term and thinking around issues of sustainability,
Hmm.
communities that are sustainable. I have a personal belief that those communities are mixed income, mixed use communities. Those are the communities that are going to be sustainable, giving people an opportunity to move from one level of income to the next, and as they get older, perhaps to move down to a different level of sort of income generation. And so to me, those are vibrant and growing communities. And I believe there are times we allow, a very small minority that's short term in thinking to sort of drive our public policy. And those things need to change. So if you were to ask me sort of what are the barriers of affordable housing, we went over some of them already. This notion of just understanding what it is and
Hmm.
understanding, how it fits into the social, economic, and community fabric, and then this notion of, well, then how do we produce policies that are more long-term thinking, policies around single family housing or zoning, things of that, or just even the speed in which you can drive projects through a process.
Right.
What are we emphasizing? What are we supporting? If we can start having those more sort of robust policy conversations and painting the picture so that folks can understand the decisions that they're making. Well, okay, if I'm 10 years down the road, if I've just supported, single family housing, what's my community going to look like?
Right.
It's probably going to look like Friendship Heights.
When you think about tax credits as an incentive, is that enough?
Interesting. Well, one, I appreciate the tax credit program. I appreciate it for what it is. During the late 80s, it kind of came about, vehicle to connect the private sector's equity into a public policy problem. That's one of the great solutions to this. I don't believe tax credits alone, given the competition, given the need, that tax credits alone will solve whether it's the housing problem or the affordable problem, that you're going to need tax credits plus. The other thing that I appreciate about the tax credit program is, for the most part, it's bipartisan. Now, it hasn't been totally voted on, and with the Senate, it's being held up for political reasons. But for the most part, Republicans and Democrats alike support it. So from that perspective, like, that's great. Getting anything that's bipartisan through, whether it's the House or the Senate, that's a plus. But it's limited. It's limited in terms of our ability to produce housing. And I would also say that it's skewed towards, it's not enough in terms of the amounts of credits, and it's skewed towards new production, which, we know, in order to solve ourselves, we can't build ourselves out of this problem. So new production is just one piece. So what we have to do is we have to understand how to support preservation as well. And so
Okay.
we need more tools for that. And those could come in the form of federal government subsidy. It could come in the form of local subsidies. It could come in the form of certain preferences for certain projects to get through. But we need every hand on deck, every set of tools that we can, in order to boost the production of affordable housing or maintain the affordability where it already exists in communities.
There's this concept that you hear a lot in affordable housing circles about naturally occurring affordable
That's correct.
housing, which seems to be a significant portion of what the affordability market needs to have. Can you explain that a little bit, and how you, as an owner, operator, developer, really look to naturally occurring affordability as something that is a tool to create more housing?
So in the beginning, AHC has been around since 1975, and in the beginning of our history, we probably had a majority of our properties were acquisition or naturally occurring affordable housing, and that's housing where the market rate rents are already at affordable levels. So the market rate rents are probably set in a place where people who are earning at 60% AMI could afford to live there. And the notion was, let's take those properties down, put them in our portfolio, and preserve them as being affordable, as opposed to taking the development route of taking those properties down, adding amenities, and then jacking up rents. And so I would say earlier on in our career, that was close to 100% of what we did. Then, of course, you have the tax credit program coming out, and everyone sort of crowded around that soccer ball to get to that tax credit program and do new construction. The unfortunate part about it, in terms of our experience, is a unit of naturally occurring affordable housing costs half as much as a new production. So on average, we are spending maybe anywhere from $400 to $550,000 per unit on new construction, whereas naturally occurring or acquisition is probably half as much.
Okay.
So therefore, the dollars go twice as far.
Right.
If we can push the system to begin to support preservation.
So how do we think about creating a lot of affordability, a lot of housing? What are the things that are missing that we need to start stepping up on to make this happen even further? Whether it's a government thing or it's from the private market, and I think it's both, but what is it that needs to happen so that we start, we've got 500,000 people to put in housing. What do we have to do in order to make sure those people have a place to live?
We got to do all the above, right?
Yeah.
So you need new, and I'm going to get to the partnerships, but you need new construction, you need naturally occurring affordable housing, you need acquisition rehab. You also need adaptive reuse, whether it's adaptive reuse of old warehouses, adaptive reuse of schools. You need all of the above, and you need creative use of land that's out there, especially if land that's in the public sector, that you can contribute that to the development and write down the basis and cost of development. So you need all the above, just in terms of how do you approach it to beef up supply. The other part of that, in order to actually get there, creative partnerships. The private sector, we just came through a ULI meeting where former Senator and Hillary Clinton of New York, she spoke to us, and she basically said the private sector has a role to play, in terms of its expertise, problem solving, its capital, all those things. So I do believe we need to enlist the private sector differently. We are fortunate where we have creative partnerships with private developers, and one example of that would be the Westerly in Washington, D.C., where let's say it's 450 units, 1/3 is going to be affordable, the other 2/3 are market luxury. But we came together in a very short period of time to put that project on the map. I think we need more creative partnerships like that. We need to sort of reach out. Medical industry, they understand now the intersection of health and housing, and there are a lot of folks, whether it's Kaiser or other folks, whether investing directly in affordable housing or partnering up with nonprofits or for-profits to build housing for the nurses or for the maintenance workers and those things. So we need to bring everyone to the table in terms of solving the problem. It's not just nonprofits doing this or the public sector, but a holistic group of folks coming in to actually help solve the problem.
That to me is particularly interesting when it comes to AHC. You're a non-for-profit.
That's right.
But you are behaving through your partnerships, through some of the more kind of innovative projects that you're doing. You are behaving as if you are focused on the profitability and the sustainability of your operation on a go-forward basis. Can you talk a little bit more about how you're thinking about projects like the Westerly, where absolutely this is a brand new product, it's a profitable product, and you're partners with the for-profit developer, and that is creating an environment where you're able to create a lot of affordability in the same location. It's a beautiful property, by the way. I got a chance to take a look at it. I think I would defy you to find someone who wouldn't want to live there. There's no way of knowing whether something is affordable or market rate. It's all part of the same package. And it creates that mixed use environment that we've been talking about as an aspiration for all of us.
Well, it goes to the point that I was making earlier, Gunnar, that we should not view affordable housing as an inferior good. And it doesn't have to be. It doesn't have to lack the amenities and all those things. And I would be also remiss if I didn't mention part of what we do. We are known in the market as this nonprofit, affordable housing owner, operator, and developer that's been around for almost 50 years. All that is true. But to me, what's even more important is what we provide on the resident services side, because to me, the sort of meshing it. I mean, I'm going to get to the model of who we are and what we do, but the notion of being able to provide a resident experience that's positive for folks who are limited in terms of their incomes. To me, marrying and integrating that together is what really makes this work for us. The reason that we work the way we work is because we are mission driven,
Hmm.
and we realize that in order to pay for the mission, you're going to have to create some margin. And so if you look at our model is a combination of mixed income. Our model is a combination of mixed use. So we have commercial underneath our affordable sometimes, and all that allows us to actually pursue either deeper affordability or pay for a lot of the extra services that we hope will be viewed as amenities, for our residents. And to be working those two things together, that's the differentiating factor, and that's the thing that's going to produce those positive results. We believe, in terms of community development, social health outcomes, and well-being, as well as just general economic. We think that that's the way in order to approach this business.
Mission with a margin.
That's right.
That's a great way to think about it. And I think it appeals both to our capitalist instincts as well as our instincts about what it is that we're trying to accomplish within our environments, what in our communities, in our cities, et cetera. But I'd love for you to go a little deeper on that in terms of resident services being your secret sauce, your differentiator. How do you structure that? How are you thinking about that when you are kind of laying out your strategy? And by the way, a strategy that, my understanding, you're looking to double your portfolio
We are.
in the near term. So you really are aggressively trying to build more and more housing. How does worrying about resident services fit into that very aggressive strategy?
Well, what's interesting, Gunnar, is that there are sort of real estate examples where customer service is at the top. If we look at hotels, the way one hotel differentiates itself from another is the types of customer service that it can provide. What we're doing is providing a deeper level of customer service that supports the resident. And in the end, to me, that's a great business proposition because you have stronger residents, more engaged, less turnover, less volatility on the income side, and hopefully even, let's say, a curtailed level of expense inflation because of what we've done to our residents. Now, the interesting piece is that, first off, resident services has evolved over the last 30, 40 years. It's evolved from a nice to have to something that we're looking at as very integral to what we do. So if you ask us what we do, in the past, we would have said at AHC, we provide, affordable housing, and on the side, maybe we do some resident services. Going forward, we believe our product needs to be providing a platform so that folks could transform their lives. So we're not looking at it as sort of bricks and mortar only, but a platform where if you come to live at an AHC property, then you will have an opportunity to do something remarkable in your own life. And so that's when I talk about that secret sauce, it's the understanding how working with the human capital development is very integral to actually promoting and supporting value on the real estate side.
So, in other words, in order to create more affordability, you're not just working on the cost side of this, you're looking to help them basically have more income because they're more successful on an economic level, whether it's through education or access or all the different things that you're doing within resident services. I like that. It's all hands on deck. It's not just about lowering costs. It's about increasing their capital, their ability to pay, so that suddenly the percentage of their income that's going to housing drops, not because it's cheaper housing, but because they're making more money. I mean, one of the easy ways to make things more affordable is make more money, and then you can pay for more. So I like that. I like how it's actually more of a capitalist model than, strictly speaking, a charitable model.
Exactly.
When you're talking about resident services, you're talking about how you create stability of cash flow for the overall enterprise.
Right.
That's interesting.
That's right. And to me, it gets to the crux of the matter, and that is sort of the larger macro problem of increasing rents and household income not being able to keep pace with increasing rents. On our real estate side of who we are and what we do, we're working on supply. We're working on creative ways to maintain certain levels of affordability. And so that's going to handle this sort of notion of increasing rents. On the household income side, we're hoping to provide that platform that will fortify people's lives so they can stabilize their incomes. We connect people to services, we connect people to opportunities that then will allow them to actually grow that income level. To me, that's a better bet.
Within that, I think there's a model that you're developing right now, or at least a project that you're developing right now, that I think really expresses all of the above in terms of how you're approaching things, and that is the Goodwill project that was announced within the last year or so. Can you talk a little bit about that? Because I think it's fascinating, and I think anyone who sees this starts to see the vision kind of demonstrated in sticks and bricks, if you will. Can you talk a little bit about that project?
So Goodwill started off probably in the early 30s as really two things. It was to help people who are down and out on their luck. There were two components to it. There was a training component to get people retrained into industry that would allow them to go off and become successful. And then there was this thrift store notion where people who couldn't afford certain goods, if goods were donated, those donated goods were repurposed for folks who actually had the needs, whether it was needs for appliances or so. There's a donation center and there's a training component to Goodwill, and that's what existed for a number of years, and it still does until we knock it down on Route 50. So it is a place that provides for training, workforce training, types of training, as well as a donation center for folks to donate their gently used clothes or gently used appliances, be resold at affordable prices for folks to pick them up. And so that was the store. Booming business in sort of the greater DC area. It was the largest grossing Goodwill. They were faced with a decision that the plant just wasn't efficient the way it was laid out, and they were going to tear it down and build new. Again, this to me, sort of enlightened CEO and president, was charged with asking a question: is it just a Goodwill, or could we do something else? And so now you have a site. They put out an RFP. We responded to the RFP where we're going to combine a Goodwill store, and on top of the store, 5 floors of affordable housing. And so to me, that's a very creative way to deal with issues around density. A place that was just commercial is now going to be mixed use, commercial as well as residential.
And it's a beautiful project. I've seen some of the renderings. Certainly, it's still in the design and approval process, but this looks to be a really exciting place to live, and for some people even to work, and to be above thriving retail at the same time. To me, it seems like a personification of the urban vision, the ability to have all these uses occurring in the same location. But it's also land that has probably been overlooked for some time. It's been zoned commercial. It's a place where people go to leave off their gently used clothes and appliances, et cetera. It's not necessarily a place where people go, oh, this is where you're going to have a park and some land and kids playing and all this sort of stuff. But what you're doing is taking underutilized land that's in a centralized location and shifting it into something that also provides housing. It's fascinating.
It provides housing, Gunnar, but in addition, the opportunity for placemaking.
Yeah.
As opposed to just a transaction of dropping off or picking up, it is now a place where people will live,
Hmm.
And who knows what will happen from an urban perspective once you start putting, 100 and some odd families on top of Goodwill. There'll be all these other, and that's why I go back to this housing, affordable housing, all those things are catalysts for and platforms for economic development. There are these connections that we just miss out on when we try to approach things from a suburban model perspective.
It's interesting. I don't think I hear very many people in the affordable space talking about placemaking. That to me sounds like something you do at the higher income spectrum, where you're talking about some really nice condominiums and some high-end stores and a shiny office building all in the same place and a wonderful plaza. And we've seen that model across the country, but you're talking about it in the context of affordability.
Exactly. Because we're talking about it from the perspective of what's the end product. I mean, to me, the end product is for folks to have a transformative living experience. In
Hmm.
order for you to have a transformative living experience, we're going to have to deliver some other things to the table.
Right.
The housing unit is just one thing. The programming, it's another thing. The connection to community and how we support the connection to the community, that's a different thing. And the fact that this is going to be mixed use, I mean, matter of fact, some of those folks who perhaps work at Goodwill will qualify to live right upstairs.
Right. I like that. And that makes it even more sustainable because they're not having to spend an hour and a half somehow getting to work. That's fantastic. It also seems to me to be investable.
Mhm.
That also seems to add to the sustainability, that you're not relying simply upon grants or on government programs. Those are part of this and how you make this happen, but this is also an investable product.
I agree. And Gunnar, this is not something that's unique. We have 10 other properties that are mixed use properties in our portfolio. 4 or 5 of them, we have Montessori schools at the bottom. There are 3 that are just straight retail. The balance of the properties we rent out to other nonprofits at sort of lower
Mhm.
rents per square foot.
If there were one thing, one myth or a misconception, what is the one thing that people get wrong about affordability?
I'm not sure it's just one thing, Gunnar. It might be a couple of things. And so let me tell you the 2 or 3 things that come to mind. One of the first things that come to mind is, how we view things like housing and affordable housing and how we at times rely on the private marketplace to allocate resources and everything. Where I personally, and we've been talking around it, I believe there are certain private sector qualities of housing, but there's also social quality of housing that we have to understand. We have to leverage. That's the first thing. The second is this notion of stigma associated with just the term affordable housing, where you think because it says affordable, and we see what's going on now. It's happened years ago where it went from affordable housing to workforce housing to attainable housing,
Yeah.
and at the end of the day, you're paying 30% more than 30% if you come for housing, not affordable. We believe everybody should have the access to housing that's safe and affordable with a package around it. This notion of stigmatizing affordable and thinking affordable housing should be sort of inferior. I would do that. And the notion of how to think about funding. Certainly appreciate tax credit as a way to fund housing. Appreciate if folks look at housing and look at affordable housing as, and then funded it that way, supported it that way. More dollars would come in at a level.
They're good things to take away. And I think this whole conversation has been eye-opening and valuable. And we could probably do it for another hour at this point, but we're running out of time. So we're going to have to close this out. But we've been speaking with Paul Bernard, who's the CEO of AHC, Affordable Homes and Communities. Thank you for spending time with us on the AFIRE podcast.
Thank you, Gunnar.
You have been listening to the AFIRE podcast. Remember to subscribe on your favorite podcast subscription service, such as Apple, Spotify, Google, Stitchers, and others. AFIRE is not engaged in providing tax, accounting, or legal advice. No content in this podcast is to be construed as a recommendation to buy or sell any asset. Some information included has been obtained from third-party sources considered to be reliable, though AFIRE is not responsible for guaranteeing the accuracy of third-party information. The opinions expressed are those of its respective contributors and sources, and do not necessarily reflect those of AFIRE.